my girl, don't lie to me. Tell me, where did you sleep?
Aberdeen has been in financial hardship for decades. Its two principal income sources come from timber and fishing. Any town that's based on harvesting natural resources is in financial trouble in this country right now. And they've been down for years.
You know, Kurt lived in Aberdeen, and he spent a lot of time in Seattle. I think in Seattle, Kurt found a community that he couldn't find in the very small town where he grew up.
They weren't from here. I mean, they lived in Aberdeen. And, I mean, they had a pretty big impact locally.
They came from a small town. I came from the suburbs, but we had the same sort of shared experience in attitude and music.
His head was found in a driving wheel, but his body never was found.
In Teen Spirit, you seem to complain about the apathy of our generation. Is that right?
Whatever you want to make out of it, it's up to you.
And do you share this?
It's your crossword puzzle.
And do you share this lack of engagement yourself?
What, being apathetic?
Yeah.
Sure.
Why?
Why? Because we sleep too much.
Nirvana to me is a band consisting of three brilliant performers, and I thank them very much for sharing their talent with me. I think they're great, and I miss them.
I grew up in the town of Aberdeen, the place where Nirvana came from, and all I hear in school is how much people like myself look like Nirvana. I thought Nirvana had really nice music. I think that the media kind of ruined Nirvana.
This town has kind of an attitude. It's kind of broken up into two parts. There's the jocks, and then there's the kids like Kurt, and they're kind of like not on real friendly terms with one another. So
that's just
that wouldn't surprise me.
Pretty much a jock town. I mean, you got a lot of people that are into sports, and if you're not into sports with the majority, then you're really not in with the group. So you kind of get isolated.
You know, Kurt always talked about how in high school everyone laughed at him and beat him up, you know, and he had a hard time. And I think that probably Chris and Dave also were considered weirdos in a kind of conventional setting.
We had the same sort of shared experience of being the only punk rockers in our high school and getting beaten up and that sort of thing.
A lot of the bands that came to be known as Seattle bands weren't from here at all. Nirvana were from Aberdeen, which is a lifetime away. And so the inputs of musical style and society they came from were radically different. Nirvana weren't ever really a part of the Seattle scene until they had sold a lot of records. They never really lived here until they'd sold a lot of records.
I grew up with these bands. We went to college together. Mark Arm from Mudhoney introduced me to Bruce Pavitt, who ran Sub Pop Records. It was for me, it was natural to go out and photograph my friends' bands because I wanted to be a photographer. They, of course, needed a photographer to put their image on the records, and someone that would do it cheap as well. So that's really how it got started, was friends, and then became a business association as well.
Two words, Sub Pop. Maybe it's one word, it's kind of a fudge. Bruce Pavitt and John Poneman were a team that combined the very elements that grunge combined. Bruce was a fan of obscure music, who'd been putting out his own home tapes for many years. Jonathan had more of a business mind and was interested in making Sub Pop a more quote-unquote commercial enterprise.
Sub Pop is largely inspired by K from Olympia, which is Calvin Johnson and Candace's label. And it sort of grew into a record label. I think on the strength of having seen Soundgarden and some other early Seattle bands like Green River, they were really compelled to give it a throw. The illusion, which is popularly fostered, that Nirvana were the leaders of the Seattle scene isn't even true. I mean, even in this scene, they were relatively small players. They were seen as the young guys that were on their way up, and people liked them and wanted to support them, wanted to be helpful. But you know, the big names were Soundgarden and Mudhoney.
The early bands, like kind of the first wave of Sub Pop and whatnot, was like Green River, Soundgarden, Skin Yard, The Walkabouts, Bundle of Hiss, Feast, these bands from the mid-'80s. And Nirvana kind of came about a little bit later. They would open for everyone. So everybody, I'm sure you'll probably find some rock completist freak who has all the flyers of Nirvana opening for Skin Yard or whatever. There's kind of like the scene as it, like when you're talking about kind of the bands and the people that are close to the bands, then there's the scene, like the way that's perceived by the general public in town around the country. So, I mean, they had a pretty big impact locally just because they were friends of the Melvins and nice people and were kind of good, and, you know, Bruce and Jonathan decided to put out a single by them.
By the time Nirvana came along, a lot of the groundwork had been laid by other bands. In an odd way, Queensryche, who were from the other side of the lake and were on the Superstar track by then, had a little bit to do with it. Metal Church, who were from Nirvana's hometown, had something to do with it. Even the Melvins, who were one of the great old Seattle bands who left town like everybody who ever wanted to be anything has traditionally had to do from around here. Even they were from Aberdeen, and even their success and their ability to make their music and to get their records out has a lot to do with what happened afterwards in Seattle. If there's a common thread in the bands which are associated with the Seattle sound, it is a sense of isolation. This is a place where you can be left alone. It's also a place where there's no expectation that you will succeed, and so you're free, or were free before all these millionaires landed, to try almost anything. And it really didn't, there was no consequence. It didn't matter. If you failed, you got another dumb job, and you put out a record. And what the hell, that was better than most got done.
People have said there wasn't so much a Seattle sound or a Sub Pop sound as there was a Seattle look or a Sub Pop sound. And part of that was my photography and the way the design, all the early Sub Pop records had this real, everything was consistent, the black bar at the top and bottom of the singles. Snapshot by Charles Peterson, produced by Jack and Dino, the only credits. You know, you get 20, 30 singles or records like that, and people start to wonder.
Sub Pop were one among a number of labels that were trying to make a go of it in Seattle. And in fact, Sub Pop began as a fanzine, in which there was a sampler cassette bound in or sent with the fanzine. And it sort of grew into a record label. I think on the strength of having seen Soundgarden and some other early Seattle bands like Green River, they were really compelled to give it a throw.
It was a fanzine called Sub Pop that had cassettes with it, and Sub Pop 100 was just kind of like a vinyl version of those cassettes. But that was mainly, it had some Northwest artists on it, but it was artists from all over the states.
Sub Pop's history was rocky before Nirvana broke, and they came near failure at certain points. But signing and nurturing Nirvana was their biggest act of genius. I guess they recognized that this could be the band that would change everything, and it did.
What we're doing is nothing new. It's just that our band happened to penetrate into the mainstream.
Yeah, so mainstream kids now are realizing the fact that they can start bands.
Yeah.
I think that's very good. It's very nice and flattering that we helped aid something like that. But I don't know, that ideal has always been around in the underground.
when I left Seattle in the early 80s, there was nothing like the scene that happened over the course of the 80s. It was a working class town, it was a provincial town, small place, and the scene it had was not that different than any other scene across the country. But something happened in the 80s. People from California started moving to Seattle, and a computer industry was born that gave young people jobs and disposable incomes. And suddenly there were all these people in Seattle in their 20s who had money, who liked to go out at night. And this is what's so important for Nirvana. Kids from smaller towns would move to Seattle to find some kind of big city vibe.
There was a pretty tight-knit music community in Seattle until they became millionaires. And I think they're still pretty tight-knit, but it's a little bit more cloistered than it used to be. In the early days, the people who lived in this town lived in group houses with studios or rehearsal spaces in the basement, and a lot of bands happened simply because you were living together.
I don't think anybody really thought of it as like a sound until after the fact. There was just a bunch of bands that everybody was friends and lived together and had the same records and stuff, so, you know, they're apt to sound somewhat similar. But it's kind of like outsiders commenting on how similar the music was before. People around here really thought of it as like a movement per se. We just thought there was a bunch of good bands. And everyone was, you know, friends for so long, and it's kind of this little oasis that's separate from the kind of the media grossness of LA and New York.
The whole grunge thing is a triumph of marketing and a failure of history.
Back when Kurt was just a teen in Aberdeen, something happened in Seattle. There were punk kids who lived in the city, and there were metal kids who lived east of the lake, in the suburbs, like Bellevue. And those kids always traditionally hated each other. The city kids thought the suburban kids were hicks. The suburban kids thought the city kids were snobs. But in the early 80s, they started to get together. The metal bands and the punk bands found some kind of accord. That's what grunge came from. That's how grunge was born. There were clubs that both bands played in, but mostly I think it was just a boredom, a kind of boredom. Grunge was a return of the repressed. It was admitting what these kids came from. And in that way, it made punk into something accessible for American audiences. Before, with the Sex Pistols, with the Clash, there was a kind of a foreignness and Englishness that a lot of American kids, a lot of the American mainstream couldn't really grasp.
The effect of the success of grunge was to make people who played other kinds of music really angry. They would all say, as musicians have always said about bands like the Sex Pistols and the Velvet Underground and any other band who weren't musically adroit but were popular, what do they got that we don't got? Well, the answer is they had something to say. And that's the only answer that really matters. The problem with what came to be known as the grunge movement, and grunge is nothing more than Sub Pop's marketing acumen and some New York fashion designers grabbing a new idea off the shelf. The problem with it is that it came from very specific minds, spoke to very specific time and place, and it is now being copied widely by people who don't have a clue, who are simply playing the notes and going through the motions. Grunge happened at a time when music was in a downturn creatively. It killed the hair bands. Well, the hair bands are going to come back, I'm sure, in some sort of Jurassic Park retribution. The reaction against grunge is going to be people who can play well because it's easier for record labels to deal with them. We are hearing, to my ears, a downturn in the creativity in music because people are once again trying to copy something which has already been successful. The genius of Cobain and company was that they weren't trying to copy anything. They were just trying to say what they had to say with the skills they had to bring to bear to their instruments. And that's what art is.
There's a whole economy in Seattle that revolves around Nirvana. And it's been said a lot, but the flannel's the new spandex. You know, that's totally the case.
Kurt Cobain was really fascinated with this band called the Melvins, the heaviest band out there. They're like Sabbath times 1,000, you know? They're Sabbath to the nth degree. Now, I wouldn't say that Nirvana were a glamorous band, but they were attracted to the way in which these kinds of bands combined the heaviness of metal and hard rock with the anti-establishment attitude of punk. Rock was at a certain point where a lot of people thought it was dead. Hip-hop was more popular with young kids. The dinosaur acts of the 70s and 80s were fading away. All that rock seemed to offer was Bon Jovi, which didn't really seem like rock to a lot of people. But there was a secret underground scene across the country that had been bubbling up for a decade at least, since the punk era. That was the indie rock scene. There have been moments before that indie rock had broken through slightly, but never quite in the way that it would with Seattle. There were also the kids who had always been there and who had been frustrated before, never able to find the right kind of scene to channel their energy and the kind of craziness that came from being born in a place that's isolated from the big cities that you dream about, that rains all the time, you know, this kind of environment that stimulated a kind of a restlessness. There was no outlet for that restlessness. But suddenly, there was an outlet, and that's when grunge was born.
There was a lot wrong in this country, and it has been carefully covered up through no great conspiracy, but you tend not to notice it until something like Nirvana shows up on the landscape, and then all of a sudden there's, well, what happened? They can't play their instruments. What's going on? The usual litany of foul criticism from people who don't understand the connection that the music has to the people who are buying it.
I think the phenomenon of Nirvana is relevant because they were a good band and a socially conscious band that was the biggest band in the world. And historically, good and conscious bands aren't popular. And that's relevant, you know, that many people, that they were able to really infiltrate the world, to the, you know, these little kids that live on these rural roads in Iowa responded to those people. That's not a culture that is normally available to them.
The media tended to portray him, especially the mainstream media, the non-music media, portrayed Nirvana as a sign of the anger of American youth. But Nirvana's fans knew that this was a misrepresentation. Yes, there was anger. There was a lot of anger. There was a lot of even hatred in a way. But there was also love, and there was also vulnerability and weakness and fear and a kind of fascination with childhood and a wish to return.
Nirvana captured the growing sense that we are not going to live as well as our parents. And in their case, their parents didn't live very well. So that's a real kind of awful thing to confront when you're in your early 20s.
The kids of the 90s, many of whom, like the members of Nirvana, come from broken homes, struggle with even the idea of having a future, don't know if they'll be able to get a job, don't know if they're safe in the world, on the streets, don't trust their government. All of those feelings of confusion and anger, yes, inadequacy, all of those feelings were feelings that grunge touched on, and that Nirvana particularly touched on.
It doesn't matter to the people who live in Aberdeen what happens to someone who has left. They're busy trying to stay afloat there, and that's the case of small-town America everywhere. Once you leave, you go off to college, or you join the military, or move to LA, whatever you do, once you leave, you're gone. You don't exist except to your immediate family. You are no longer a factor in their daily life. And that's the only explanation I have for the... I'm sure there are people in Aberdeen for whom Kurt Cobain was an important part of their life, or who listened to the music, but by and large, he was as irrelevant as the lottery winner, and just as lucky. In the old days in Seattle, there was one club to play, and you could play once or twice a month. And you'd better be damn good that night, because it was the only charge you were going to get that month. In part, that made this a recording scene more than a performance scene, but it also meant that when the bands from Seattle got up on stage, they were fully focused and committed to what they were doing. And it wasn't the kind of locker room football player dude, we rock, that you're going to get out of a hair band or a metal band. It was a kind of religious fervor, to put it a little more extremely than I really mean it. It was a kind of release. And when they went out on the road, I think it's one of the things which really made a big difference here. When Seattle bands showed up, they were really good live.
The first time I saw Nirvana was at the Vogue Tavern. It was the first time they played in Seattle, and they had Aaron Burkhart, I believe, as their drummer. And it was a Sub Pop Sunday night. They were opening for Blood Circus. Everyone had sort of heard about this band, and we all, you know, the members of Mudhoney and Soundgarden and Sub Pop all came out to see them. And I was standing in the back, and I looked at Jonathan Ponham, and I said, "Are you sure you want to put out by these guys?" And I had my camera there, and I didn't bother to photograph them. I thought that they were pretty atrocious. 6 months later, they released Love Buzz. They had a new lineup, and they were amazing. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen before.
I remember the first time I saw them was at a club called the Vogue, and I just went because Bruce Pavitt called everyone up and said, "There's this band, and they're friends of the Melvins, and supposedly they're really good. You should all go see them." So it's kind of like any friend of the Melvins, you know.
When I heard that single, I played it and played it and played it. I think I wore out the first copy of it that I had. Every party, you just Love Buzz. It would just get everybody moving. It was really. I know that Nirvana weren't so happy that their first big hit or their popular song was a cover, you know, and they didn't even really, I think, want to release it on a single. But it was just a phenomenal pop song.
So I guess like when the Sub Pop single came out, that kind of like officially made them part of the scene or whatever. More integral than that is that they wrote far poppier and catchier songs than their cohorts. So in a way, it's almost that their sound was less kind of gothic and scary that was largely responsible for their success.
There's a particular moment when I think you can hear Nirvana becoming the great band that they became. It's a song called Sliver, which originally was a Sub Pop single and is now included on the Incesticide EP. In a way, it contains the basic story that Kurt was telling, this urge, this desire to find a safe space in an ugly world.
I wish we would have thrown a bomb in the music business and they all would have been at least dismembered, but I don't know, it was more like a firecracker, ladyfinger. Yeah. Pop.
Years ago, I had an opportunity to see Nirvana in the Vogue, and I passed it up and said, those guys suck, I don't want to see them. Regretted it to this day.
We had the opportunity to play one of our very first gigs with the band. I'm in the band, the Rhino Humpers, and we were given this opportunity thanks to our drummer's mom, who booked him at this club in Tacoma at that time, which was called the Legends. And they played there along with the Melvins, another band called Machine, and we opened up. We had a 20-minute slot. It was a pretty incredible opportunity for us to get to play for those people. Nirvana was my favorite band at the time, and all of ours. So it was a real honor. And then just to watch them play was something else. That was a real incredible experience. I don't think I had seen that raw form for quite a while. It was really, really, really cool. And that was very inspiring for me from that moment on.
My style really, it reflected what was happening in the music. The Blurred movement didn't have, I did that on purpose. It didn't just happen by accident. Though every time I got a proof sheet back, the blurs, you didn't really know what was going to be there, you know. But after a while, I got a sense that if you move the camera to this side, the blur's not going to go through the person's face. It's going to reflect somehow in the movement of what the performer is doing. I probably shot like 25,000 frames of film with the Seattle music scene. So I'd go to a gig and shoot 300-400 shots in a night. And for the most part, 75% of them were great shots. Well, photographing Nirvana, Kurt was very shy, and Chris was very tall. It was very difficult to, especially doing group photos, to sort of get them all on the same plane, you know, because both Chad and Kurt were, you know, several feet shorter than Chris.
All I remember is that I thought the guy had a cool voice and that Chris was tall. And, you know, I mean, I'm sure I was just talking at the bar or whatever. Cool voice, you know. But I didn't, you know, really think twice about it.
It's undeniable that Kurt Cobain's voice had something that captured the imagination of the world. It was that weariness, that sense of vulnerability that opened his songs up, made people feel that they could identify with him.
I was going to Nirvana gigs, photographing them from early on. So he was still he always expressed dislike of having his photograph taken though. But he was, once you got the camera in front of him, he may have just sat there with his hands in his pockets, but that was Kurt, and he was very photogenic, very photogenic. You know, it's rare that you see a picture of Kurt that isn't good just because of who he is. Chris is very, very close with Kurt. They were boys, you know. They were these two boys from Aberdeen, and they had a lot of experience growing up and being boys in high school. I mean, they were the only two that could really relate to each other, I think. One day, they knocked on my door at the studio. This was years and years ago, and they came in and they said, "We have an idea for this record cover that we want to do." And Kurt had just gotten this kitten, and somehow if you pulled the cat's face back, it made this, like, its eyes went funny, and we tried for 15 minutes to get this thing that they wanted, and it just wasn't working. And then they just, well, okay, and then he left, you know? And they were always just coming up with things like that.
This dude, John McEnroe, he plays guitar and a lot of tennis, of course. And he's probably one of Nirvana's biggest fans. Totally inspired by, like, the songwriting and everything. And he would go and you know, kick some tunes and play Nirvana covers. So it was nice that I could play their tunes with someone who was a marginal player and get still a couple thousand people off, you know, on Nirvana.
Kurt Cobain was very, very serious cat. The songs they cut right to the heart of a lot of stuff. They cut right to the soul of a lot of the things, a lot of the shit that I go through. So much respect to Kurt Cobain.
The very first time I photographed Nirvana was I went over to Bainbridge Island where Chad was living, and they were there, they were going to practice. So we just spent the day driving around in the extremely trashed Ford Econoline that we drove around the countryside in, just looking for locations. And I had my girlfriend with me, and there were just several people riding around the van with us, and we'd stop in a field, and I'd take their picture, and they were very naive and it was a beautiful day. It was definitely innocent compared to what would come later.
Bleach was the best, I thought, in my opinion, and I'm really glad that the other members, Chris Novoselic and the drummer, I don't know his name, but I'm glad that they're off doing their own careers too.
Just before things started getting big in Seattle, actually, I was looking for some kind of group to get on, to be free, rebellious, whatever, and just Bleach, All the Way Loud, and I remember when Nevermind came out, it just changed everything, musically in this town, socially, but on anything, I'd say it changed, and for what you see now on TV and media, when you see with rock and roll, I think it's all based somewhat because of that band and some of the other bands in town, but it created a voice, I think, maybe for the 90s and future times.
Several months after Bleach was released, they needed to do a publicity session, so Nirvana came up to my studio, and I just really wanted to do something simple with them. And so I just had a piece of white seamless paper hung up, and Kurt comes in and he's just like, I hate white seamless paper. That's just has nothing to do with punk rock or us or anything. So I said, well, here's a can of spray paint. Do something. You know, I don't know what else to do with you guys. And so he painted a plus, just without hesitating, painted a plus and a minus on the piece of paper. And it was perfect. Definitely had connotations because the way most of the shots were done, Chad was sitting under the minus sign, and I think about 2 weeks later, he was out of the band.
Dave Grohl is Nirvana's secret weapon. There's no doubt about it. His power drumming is what finally pushed their sound forward, out of what was kind of a muddy and confused sound before. Also, Dave's instincts, like Kurt's instincts, are toward a combination of punk and pop.
Nirvana's mass cool. Really like Nirvana, really admire Dave Grohl as a drummer.
I became a drummer because I listened to Dave sit there and pound away on the drums. And when Kurt died, I felt like a chunk of my heart came out.
With a twist of lemon.
With Dave, there was definitely a change in the sound, and I think Kurt's songwriting changed, progressed. Probably more than just about any other band, their songwriting progressed. Performance-wise, I didn't see that much of a change, I think they really, in fact, it got more crazy, if anything else. I think they translated to the large stages really well, better than any other three-piece you can think of.
I think one of the reasons why Nirvana was the group to break and not, say, Mudhoney or another Seattle band was because of Dave Grohl, because of his drumming, because of the aggressiveness of his drumming, and because of the sort of punk spirit, the DC punk spirit that he brought, that colored that music. And that's about two different scenes combining in one band.
To me, Kurt and the whole band, I thought were very natural players. They weren't concerned with, oh, I missed this note, or they were more concerned as what the music and the gig was like as a whole.
I think Chris and Kurt had an almost symbiotic tie. They were so close, and their playing was like one person in a way. But Dave was the stranger, the new element that made Nirvana into the supergroup that they became.
There's a shot of Dave Grohl at the Seattle Center Coliseum in '93, I believe. Don't get too many shots of drummers, but this one of Dave it really sums up his power, his ability.
I think other people started to, like when they signed to Geffen, and people like Geffen and kind of people in the music business started to realize that it might start to take off before the band did. Because the band just, did what they always did. They just played shows and wrote music.
By the time Nirvana were signed to Geffen, Mother Love Bone were Big Bonus Baby signed to Mercury or Polygram or some corporate entity down there. Soundgarden had already signed to A&M. It was already clear that it was now for the first time possible for Seattle bands to be taken seriously in the major marketplace. Nirvana were signed at a time when Sub Pop were in some financial disarray and when lots of bands were looking for ways out.
Yeah, it's the only record release party that I've been to where the band got kicked out of their own party. Geffen bought all the beer for the first 2 hours, and everyone took good advantage of it, including the band. There was a bunch of vegetable platters with a bunch of dips, and those, there was like large quantities of dips and hollowed out vegetables, and those ended up all over the place. So the floor was all sticky from the oils and the dips, so everybody was kind of sliding around in the floors of the place. But yeah, you know, but that was okay. At the time that everyone got kicked out, it was time to be kicked out.
Because no one from this area had really been a star, no one expected to be a star, and certainly no one knew how to behave.
Nirvana never became like, you know, Stone Temple Pilots or something, or Live, or any of these more generic alternative bands. Nirvana always maintained this magical tension, and a lot of that tension came from the band members' own divided feelings about success and about the mainstream. Kurt often talked about how much he hated being a rock star. We know that side of Kurt's story. We know that side of the band's story. But what isn't acknowledged as much is that Kurt also loved playing his music and made music that reached so many different people. Smells Like Teen Spirit is an anthem for the 90s, and Kurt and Chris and Dave willingly went in that direction.
What it really meant to me was just a new beginning, kind of a new spark. And when I first heard Nirvana, I would listen to the songs and I had no idea what he was saying in the lyrics. But it was like the music itself just gave you this feeling that you couldn't forget. It was like embedded inside of you. And no matter what, even if you didn't know what the lyrics were, the music transported you into that realm that Kurt Cobain wanted you to be in.
We were just listening to videos, and Smells Like Teen Spirit was on all the time. All of a sudden, everybody was just requesting the same video over and over, and it really struck a chord, a real deep chord in some of us, especially me. When I got out of jail and I bought the album and I listened to the whole thing, I was, to say the least, I was impressed. I was blown away.
One of the best shows I ever saw was a surprise gig at the University in Bellingham, opening for Mudhoney. And there was a photographer, I was shooting away, and there was this bunch of photographers there, and there was this one photographer who kept getting in my way, and I was like, why aren't you taking pictures? It's Nirvana, you know? And he's like, look, man, I have one frame. He's like, look, man, I have one frame of film left, and I'm saving it for the destruction climax. And I was just like, get out of my way. And it ended up that they didn't do a destruction. They brought these two 7-year-old kids on stage, these two 7-year-old boys, strapped their instruments around them, and these kids just stood there and kind of like strummed, you know, Chris's giant bass, and then everyone shouting, destroy them, destroy them. Well, the kid with the bass took it off, and I have a picture of it somewhere, and just somehow managed to get that bass over his head and pounded it on the stage. And Chris was just horrified because that wasn't the bass to do that with.
When Seattle bands showed up, they were really good live. I can remember going to New York and for one of the music conferences and stumbling into a show at which somebody was playing that I knew and watching them just destroy an East Coast band who were doing the same kind of music, but just weren't even close to having the kind of focus and intensity.
These were really turning point gigs for them because there were like 500 to 1,000 people at these shows.
They were always like really a great band. At that point, you knew that they were, you know, they're a cool band.
When they played Blue and everyone just went crazy, you know, I mean, they already had these, even though the record had been out for 6 months, they already had these hits that people knew and sang along to. And this is a great shot because of the Nirvana Elvis Cooper hanging.
What did you get by smashing guitars in the scene?
Satisfaction, climax.
Don't have to do encores.
Yeah, there you go. It's a good excuse not to have to do it all over.
You could line up 40 people and have them, 40 musicians, and have them jump on the drum kit like that, and you would never get that same, that determined look, that calm look on his face. You know, he's not grimacing, he's just doing it. I think that as an artist, that was the work he had to do. You know, he had to get it out of himself, because I think that like a lot of people, all the stress and you know, whatever personal problems he may have had in his life, they all came out through his music, his art.
It was my only big rock revelation experience was a Nirvana show, and it's for real. And it's corny to say now because, it's like, well, I remember this old Nirvana show, and it was this big revelation. But for real, there was a show at the place called the OK Hotel, and it was about 6 months before Nevermind came out, and it was the first time they ever played Teen Spirit, and it was a packed show. It's just a zoo. The place was just gross, and and it was a cool show, and it was going along just fine. And they said something like, well, the song's called Teen Spirit. Like, Teen Spirit, it's a dumb name. And they played the song, and people knew, because people would see the band all the time, and people knew all the songs on Bleach, and they knew most of the newer songs at that point that were new, like In Bloom and Dive and Been a Sun and Sliver, and so people were attuned to the songs that weren't recorded yet. But they say there's this Team Spirit song, and they started playing it, and seriously, a minute into it, people kind of started looking at each other, and right after the first chorus, and kind of mumbling, what the, this is great. And you could literally look around and see people freaking out about this song. And my friend Susan, who I was with, ran outside, and later I found out she thought she was going to throw up. She was so moved, and afterwards there was this second of silence, which is a long time for there to be silence after a song ends. And I was standing next to Kurt Bloch, who's in the Fastbacks, and I just kind of look up at him, and he looks down, what was that? I don't know. That's the best song I ever heard, and people were really talking about it. What was that song they played? And when was the last time you went to a show and afterwards people singled out a song that no one had ever heard before? That's exactly when I knew that they were destined for the big time.
Nevermind comes out 8 months after the Gulf War, which had 90% approval ratings, theoretically. The people who bought Nevermind are not the people who were measured by opinion polls. And I think that a whole generation realized how far outside of the mainstream we really were. That record became a kind of rallying point for a little while. It broke through the anonymity of despair that one feels in an isolated place when one holds views that are not widely held.
And it is a shame that song is like Stairway to Heaven or whatever now, because it really genuinely is an amazing song.
We got a lot of attention, you know what I mean? A lot of, Teen Spirit was kind of played into the ground, kind of made me feel a little self-conscious, What do you guys think of Hysteria?
Oh, it's a load of shit. I think there are at least 10 to 15 other bands who are just as good, if not better than us, and they deserve just as much attention as we do if they choose to take that attention, if they want it.
Tad, Alice in Chains, Nirvana, Mudhoney, those bands really don't sound the same, at all. One's a metal band, kind of, and one's a garage rock band, and the other's kind of more of a Beatles punk band. So when all this really started going down, all the bands had their little kind of specified market, so they really weren't stepping on each other's toes.
When Nirvana hit the radio, it was like, I don't know, it was like that sound that you could listen to, the sound that you could dance to, and that you could take with you anywhere, and basically that my parents could tolerate. Thought it was a great sound.
Well, I guess Nirvana just means unequivocal music to me, just intense vibrations of the soul. Just there's been nothing like that pre-Nirvana to me, except for possibly Sonic Youth. Just Nirvana is beautiful music.
Never mind, it's such a crazy good record. I mean, I remember when it was done and people had advanced tapes and whatnot, and it was shocking how good that record was.
Sold out everything. We've had really good stock on them. They sell a lot for us, and we cleaned out really quick. I mean, we're down to the last little singles, so we got rid of the albums about noon.
So you're all out of stock of Nirvana albums as of right now?
A bunch on order. We'll have them back in tomorrow.
It's probably the biggest selling record in my store.
It introduced America to its musical underground. For better or worse, I'm not sure. You know, because now I think it used to be that you had to discover these things for yourself. That the youth had to search these things out, and it was something really special. Now a lot of it's organized for the kids.
Here you have this band that they were ahead of their time. They were making, you know, poetry, and they were doing things that nobody understood, but everybody loved. And then they faded out with the death of their lead singer and lyrics writer.
I think people tend to overanalyze the whole situation. It was just a good band. They sounded good. They were different.
They went from being the best underground band in the world to being the most important band in the world in about 6 weeks. These guys didn't have the beginnings of a clue as to how they were supposed to protect themselves. It had just never even occurred to them that this could happen to them. And until you've been out on the road and been down that road, you don't realize what a grind it is. I mean, it's one of the great fallacies of rock and roll that being a rock star is a good thing. It's not good for the music if you listen to the records people make after they've become successful. And it's not good for the human beings by and large, because you're living a completely unnatural life. You're on the road. You're surrounded by people who won't tell you the truth because it's not in their best interest to tell you this truth. You have 23 hours a day of travel and boredom and an hour a day on stage when you get to get your yayas out. It isn't a whole lot of fun. Most of the people in the grunge scene weren't drawn to the road for the reasons that, say, the hair bands they replaced might have been, which is to say free drugs and copious bimbos. That really wasn't a big part of the orientation here. It wasn't why people made the music. And that's why the music was, I think, more responded to by people, because it was real.
One of the most intense experiences I had photographing Nirvana live was at the Reading Festival in the UK in 1992. Just prior, like 5 days prior, Courtney and Kurt had Francis, and there were a lot of rumors that Nirvana weren't going to play because Kurt's health was so bad, and just all these rumors flying. Well, they came on, and actually Kurt got wheeled on in a wheelchair with a gray wig by the Melody Maker journalist Everett True. And actually, I think this is one of the only photos that captured that. I was the only photographer that was allowed on stage that day. And it was really intense to have Nirvana playing in front of you and 45,000 fans all steaming from a whole day of rain and mud, singing along to every Nirvana song. It really sent chills up my spine. And this is kind of a symbolic photo of Kurt reflected in his silhouettes.
Kurt didn't, later, I think it's very well documented how he felt about success, but Chris and Dave just were great, yeah.
What do you want to know?
Okay.
Eddie speaks.
Obvious question right off. What's it like to win one of these things?
I've already got 2 of them. I have 3 toilets, and I put 2 of them in each toilet so far, and now I have 1/3, so I've
That's the
got
American
all
dream.
match.
2 3-car garage, too.
Yep.
That's right.
Hey, can I have that cookie, too?
You know, it seems that people come to these things not so much to win the awards and take them home, but
and, you know, put them there for the party, for the whole thing, and see live performances. Is that kind of it?
No, because if we don't come, they won't show our videos on MTV, and our careers will be over.
Yeah, you have to schmooze or they'll.
Yeah.
You have to get a spot.
We're here to glad hand.
It's not choose or lose, it's schmooze or lose.
Schmooze or lose.
Is that true? Yeah, how important is MTV in determining what not only America, but what the rest of the world gets to even hear?
What do you think?
And that's
it's a monopoly. It's a 99% monopoly.
And that's a disturbing paradox between the access MTV has to the people of the world and the potential that it's just pissing away.
It's become a catalog for, like, you know, middle America viewers. They decide that the hot new video is the hot new band of whatever.
So people would say that you guys did really well with MTV and MTV exposure.
We did well financially and success-wise, but that doesn't mean that doesn't have anything to do with our music or what we want to say. It's just that we wanted to participate in the music industry, so we participated with MTV. We sold out.
Yep.
Kill us. Pressure is on you that you better show up and you better, you know, do all the press and all that.
Well, they said that they know where my little sister goes to school, and that
there's already been a couple car
my mom's address, where she lives, and that's scary when they start threatening your family.
When you go on to another album, when she's coming out, is there any more pressure to play the game, or is the pressure off to keep buying into the whole system?
No. As of right now, officially, it's over with. You've got the first scoop. I quit.
The new record, the new album is a concept album based on a fictitious, speculative romance between Edward Shevardnadze and Boris Yeltsin.
Did you do a video for it?
Yeah. I'm going to be Mikhail Gorbachev. Vernon's going to be Leonid Brezhnev. We're going to glue toothbrushes to his eyebrows and dye him black. And Dave is going to be Raisa Gorbachev. And we're going to express our sexual frustrations.
Okay, okay, one more. Go, chug.
Look, alfalfa impersonation.
All right, thanks.
Hey, thanks a lot.
All right.
I used to hate it when bands would be on soapboxes or whatever, talk about stuff because it's just pretentious. And then, but with Nirvana, I could see, and especially reading some of their fan mail, I mean, these kids would say, you know, I used to beat up gay people, and then you told me not to, and now I don't. I mean, it was that direct. It's like, if they could. I mean, then I completely turned around. I was like, Kurt, you got to go on a speaking tour of the world and, like, tell these people what to do. That's so great. And, you know, I really came to realize what kind of, like, political power they had.
Kurt was very interested in feminism. He considered himself a feminist. He cared about women's expression, and he cared deeply about how men and women can hurt each other and how sexism hurts both men and women. Kurt was in touch with his feminine side. He cared about women musicians. The women rockers who have burst forth were able to do that in large part because of that gateway that Nirvana created, and because the generation that Nirvana represents believe in equality for men and women and believe in challenging traditional sex roles.
I photographed Kurt for The Advocate, the national gay and lesbian monthly. And I just went to his hotel room. He was staying in a hotel here, he and Courtney and Francis, because no one would rent him a house at the time. Damage deposit was too big, I guess. So he was staying in a hotel, and we just got to talking. And I asked him, well, can I photograph you while you're talking? And he said, sure. And I got these really, really intimate, almost like tender photographs.
One of the best things that Kurt ever said was that, and he said in the liner notes to Incesticide maybe, or one of those, he's like, if you're a racist, sexist, a homophobe, or in any way an asshole, don't buy my record. I don't care that you like me, because I hate you. I don't want your money.
He really hit home on a lot of subjects and then his suicide totally tore me apart. It was like losing a father figure, because he was there to listen to my problems. Even if he wasn't there in person, I'd just pop a tape and play it and feel totally at peace.
The song Rape Me in particular, you know,
people think it's like specifically about rape, but I mean, my interpretation is about how he felt as though, you know, he was raped, you know, by society, you know, about society's rape, you know, on human beings in general, you know.
I think that Kurt was not afraid of difficult subject matter, not afraid of the unpleasant and dark side of experience and of his own self.
Kids just listen to what they're supposed to. And I think that's kind of what was funniest about Nirvana, is that later these kids would realize, you know, hold on a minute. These guys are telling me the gay people are cool, you know? And they're talking about this band that's supposed to be the best band ever that I've never even heard of. And so later they're like starting to discover these things that Nirvana is directly or indirectly turning them on to, when all they meant to do was buy the album by the popular band.
A lot of what In Utero is about is the struggle to be a man, but not be an oppressive man. There are many, many lyrics on In Utero that are about the body. Songs like Penny Royalty and Milk It and Scentless Apprentice all mention reproduction, the muck of the flesh.
There's all sorts of rumors going on about how your next album will sound. Some people say it's going to be really wild, raw and confusing. Some say it's going to be really quiet and acoustic and pretty.
Both. Mixture of both. It won't be as clean as the last album, that's for sure.
That's a good album cover, or a name. Our next record, Raw Wild. If our record's that name, you're going to go, shit. You're going to go, those guys, man. Raw, wild, and confusing. We're going to be on the cover going, no, one of us is going to look raw, is going to be naked. One of us is going to look wild, with loincloth and like some wild man. One of us is going to look really confused, you know? Raw, wild, and confusing.
I have a feeling with the next record, we're going to lose a lot of our audience.
In Utero was a real sign of growth. It was a kind of a growing pains album. You can even hear it in the lyrics. I think Kurt has a line on the album where he says, "My bones grew and it hurt." He was going through a transformation in his personal life as well as in his artistic life. He'd had a child, he was in a marriage, he was working with Courtney as a creative partner.
One day in May, Kurt called me, and he wanted me to come over and photograph this collage that he had made on his living room floor, and I guess it was going to be for the back cover of In Utero. So he said, "Got to be here in an hour though, because the flowers are going to wilt." I'm like, "Oh my God, what am I getting into?" So I go over, and on the floor he had laid out all these baby fetuses and flowers, and it was very beautiful. It was very, very stunning. So I set up and photographed it, and at one point Francis wandered in, and we took some pictures. That's Francis and Courtney in front of the collage.
Revere a person because of his music, because that's what he was. He was a musician. He was a pretty good one. I saw him in concert. I bought their albums. Good stuff, but I don't know. Revere a person for their music, not because they died.
The thing about Kurt is that I believed everything he said. I believed the pain, and he's still part of my everyday life. I think about him every day.
Cobain was like one of the voices of our generation who just, you know,
kind of saw it as it was. You know, the same way that that Lennon or Jagger or Richards or McCartney kind of saw it in their time. These guys kind of came out and called bullshit. And Cobain was kind of on the darker side.
There was a lot of people out there that just listened to Nirvana because it sounded cool, and there's nothing wrong with that. But then there's a lot of other people out there that actually listen to the music a little deeper than that. And in our generation, there's a lot of problems out there. And a lot of people don't know how to deal with it. But he didn't offer answers. He let us know that there was somebody else out there that had the same problems that we did, that felt the same way about it. And so, a lot of the times that's better than giving us answers.
I think in the long run what was surprising to the mainstream was how many people identified with Cobain's howl, which is as evocative of this generation as Ginsberg's howl is of the Beat.
Whatever personal problems he may have had in his life, they all came out through his music, his art, and he would explode on stage. And if you look at the photographs of him playing, he always, like here he's smiling, but he's always aware of what he's doing, even though he's writing on these people's hands. He's finding that chord, you know, and he's always very determined. He always has a very determined look on his face.
Punk rock should mean freedom, liking and accepting anything that you like, playing whatever you want, as sloppy as you want, as long as it's good and it has passion.
This was the last group shot I did of Nirvana, and this was a session done for Alternative Press on the release of In Utero. And done down the hall here. It's kind of symbolic, the black hole there above his head. You start to see little bits of symbolism in the photographs like that. And this was actually one of the last live photos I took of Kurt, where he was, after he'd done a stage dive during a Mudhoney set, he landed back on stage and he draped the guitar around his neck and proceeded to play Fang and Black Flag covers.
Kurt's loss is such a great loss because he, more than anyone in alternative rock, was challenging the roles of men and women, challenging sex roles, and trying to point to a vision for a new kind of equality.
The day Kurt died, I was here building this gallery, and my then girlfriend and I had reservations out on the coast for a couple of days with our dog. And the first thing that happened was that I didn't believe anything I heard on the radio. The second thing that happened was the phone rang off the hook with a bunch of magazines trying to hire me to write about his death. And I was grateful that I was able to say to them, "I'm sorry, I'm out of town this weekend." As I drove through and toward Aberdeen, I flipped through the radio stations to find the local radio station. And I had it for a good 45 minutes before I lost it again. And during that time, they said absolutely nothing about Kurt Cobain, and they played none of Nirvana's music. He drove through town, as you have no choice to do if you're going to the coast, and there wasn't a single sign. There were no indications that he'd ever lived there or that he had just died. Life went on as if he'd never been. we came back through on Sunday, and I'd kind of thought, well, there'd be some placards outside the churches, because it's a church-going kind of a town on Sunday, and it would be an awfully Christian thing to say a few prayers for the man, and there wasn't a sign.
The moment that sticks in my mind is actually running into him on the street about 2 weeks before he killed himself. And it was just, you know, I guess in relation to events, I'm glad that I did. I'm glad that I saw him, and we talked, and we exchanged phone numbers, and he was really happy about the fact that the book of photographs that I'm doing, he was like, all right, at last, you know, get the real thing. And we chatted, and he was concerned about my wife's illness, and just really, you know, that sticks in my mind.
Not when people recognize you, not when you can't have a moment of, the people are waiting in the lobby of your hotel and constantly asking you for your signature, which still baffles me. I don't understand the autograph concept at all.
It can be a burden, you know, to be wanting to be famous, kind of vain, really, if you think about it. Everybody, look at me, you know. It's like, it'll pass someday, you know.
Most people who are really famous end up staying in their hotel rooms all the time. Total reclusives, and they don't do anything. That sucks.
Kurt was very shy. He was very gentle. He was always very concerned about my well-being and everyone else's well-being. He didn't really like to talk about himself too much. But on this particular day, we talked about his back problems and his stomach problems, and we talked about how he wanted to buy a house in Scotland someday, and he was very shy, and he was very calm as well.
Kurt was an expert at telling sad stories, and his own story is a sad story. But not only did he leave us with many great tales and many great songs to live by, but he opened up a whole range of emotion that hadn't really been explored in rock before.
They were very true people, I think, especially like Kurt. I see clips of him when he was on Head Baker's Ball and just came out in that yellow gown and said, all right, man, that's excellent, I love it. Just were themselves and played what they felt, and that's what rock and roll is all about. It's really good stuff, and it's what I listen to. I like it a lot. Now we're here to see Foo Fighters and Sweet 75, who are like the little bastard sons, but more power to them.
I'm a negative creep. I'm a negative creep. I'm a negative creep when I'm stoned. Those are words to live by. Kurt and Nirvana rock.
By the time Kurt died, life was a really rough survival course for him. And music, which had always been some kind of solace, didn't seem to be doing it for him anymore. I mean, the problem with being famous when you write about being isolated is that you lose your isolation. And even though he managed to keep a fair amount of distance between himself and public, it got harder and harder and harder. I could have seen Kurt withdrawing completely and being Prince, say, and just putting out records and not touring. I could have seen him blow up the band. I could have seen him doing what Pearl Jam did with Neil Young, only doing it with Michael Stipe. He could have gone anywhere and he could have gone nowhere. He could have just stopped, which is probably in the end what he should have done.
We'd see him once in a while. We'd see him walk by here. I never knew that at the time that, you know, he spent as much time under the bridge as he did. The Kurt Shrine, I guess you would call the bridge down there. Yeah. I found that out later, that the kids, oh yeah, Kurt stayed down there all the time. Him and his friends, they'd go down there and smoke their cigarettes or whatever else they wanted to do.
I think a sense of alienation is kind of a crucial part of most good songwriting.
I think Kurt changed rock. I think Nirvana has changed rock. And no matter what sad turn the tale took in the end, I think that's what we can be grateful to.
Everyone thinks it's an easy ride to fame. Everyone thinks they know you even though they only know your name. And when you're up, there's no wrong you can do. But it's when you're down that you need 'em, and there's no one there for you. You had it all the day you signed your name. They say the winner who takes all is bound to have to fall. I'm so sorry, Mr. Cobain.
Nirvana were the band that told America how unhappy its children were.
Bottled up like a cork inside. Time bomb, baby, time to say bye-bye. Pressure almost everywhere. Pressure on the street. Pressure in the air. And though I seem to just get by, never fail to justify